So good afternoon, everybody, or in Jim's case, and those of you who aren't in daylight saving time, good morning. Still, good to see you all. For those who don't know me, my name is Brett Gale. I'm the Executive Director of the Chifley Research Centre. I'd like to acknowledge that where I'm zooming from today is the Gadigal land of the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'll pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge that wherever you are today, you're on Indigenous land that was never ceded. Now, back at the start of this pandemic, as Australia and other countries embarked on their massive stimulus to combat the greatest recession in 100 years, there was a belief, particularly amongst those of us on the social democratic left, that we could use the recovery of this pandemic to build a stronger and more resilient economy. However, I think last week showed us that it's possible to have an expansionary fiscal policy while at the same time doing little to fix an already broken system. Last week, with the budget and the opposition's budget in reply, brought us two contrasting visions of Australia. On the one hand, a budget big on spending and big on missed opportunities. On the other, a leader of the opposition laying out a program to rebuild a more productive, fairer Australia as we emerge from this economic and health crisis. The Morrison's government's budget is a $1 trillion effort to return Australia to the same anemic place we were prior to the pandemic, with stagnant wages, a plague of insecure work, a broken aged care system and a childcare system in need of serious reform. Labor, on the other hand, set out a vision for making childcare affordable and accessible to every family, fixing our broken aged care system, training Australia's workers for the future and transforming our manufacturing sector. And so with those contrasting responses to Australia's future of our backdrop, I'm very pleased to be able to present the latest event in our Chifley Conversations series. And to take us through Labor's plans for the future, it's my great pleasure to welcome the former Executive Director of the Chifley Research Centre and the current Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers. G'day, Jim. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity, Brett.
And joining Jim in conversation, it's great to welcome Clare, the Shadow Minister for Innovation, Technology and the Future for Work. Welcome.
Great to be here. Great to be here. Thanks, Brett.
As always with our sessions, they will be recorded, so please don't do anything on screen you wouldn't want your mother to see. And please turn on your cameras so that we can see your smiling faces, so it's just nicer to talk to people that we can see. Of course, obviously, we have the chat function going. So as always, please put up your ideas, your thoughts and questions, and we'll get to them throughout the course of the afternoon. And with that, I might hand over to Clare to moderate our event today.
Fantastic. Well, so nice of you to have me and Jim on the channel this afternoon, Brett. Really lovely to be here. And as you can imagine, Jim and I spend extensive amounts of time running through, our sort of ideas about economic policy. Now we're doing it, with an audience, but without the fresh cold beers, Jim. At least not at my end. Brett, really important that Chifley's opened up for the discussion this afternoon. I don't actually think there's been a time in my life where the economic policy discussion has been both as fascinating, but also as important to Australia's future. It's, been the kind of pervasive thinking in Australian economic policy really since the 80s that one of the tasks of government is to try to kind of get out of the way of the movement of the economy. Yet I think we saw different approaches from the government and the opposition last week, but both, I think, accepting that that's not the right approach at this moment in time. So a very interesting kind of set of issues for us to talk about this afternoon. So we had a budget from our political opponents just about a week ago, and then I think you touched on, Brett, the fact that on Thursday last week, Anthony Albanese gave his kind of first really speech where he laid out some really substantial policy ideas that Labor wants to pursue in office. So there's a lot for us to talk about this afternoon. But Jim, I also want to make sure that we get some time at the back end to talk about some big picture issues. So we'll talk a bit about the politics of the moment, and then let's have a chat and give you the opportunity to share a bit of thinking about, how you see Labor tackling the economic challenges of the 2020s. So let's get the political stuff running. Jim, you gave a really interesting speech at the press club this week, laying out a bit of a response to the government's budget. And you talked about the kind of lack of ambition that you perceive in that document. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what you were hoping to get from government and then what you perceive about what they delivered?
Yeah, thanks very much, Claire, and for the opportunity to have a public chat with you, and thanks, Brett, for getting us together. Look, I think really the defining aspect of the budget was a lack of ambition, and closely related to that, a lack of vision, a lack of, a story about how do we make the economy better after COVID than it was before COVID, and just as importantly, where do people fit in that story of progress? And you read through the budget, and I've had to read through it over and over and over again since, in the 10 days since it was handed down. And it really is quite remarkable that it is almost entirely bereft of ambition and vision. The idea that you can rack up $1 trillion in debt, spend $98 billion in new policy announcements, and still, really raise the white flag on full employment, really not have very much beyond a kind of a 12-month election horizon, and really just not have that kind of sense of what the future economy looks like. I think it's a badly missed opportunity, and there is a partisan element to that. Clearly there are differences in our politics, but I think even objectively, and many of the economists have included this too, kind of leafing through the budget, scratching their heads a bit, trying to work out, okay, well, we know what you want to do to kind of triage this immediate problem, and that's important. But what's our end game? What are we sort of heading for? What's the direction that we want to see the country, and particularly its economy, head in? And that was missing.
Yeah, fascinating, really, isn't it? Because, you and I got into politics to try to kind of make the lives of Australians better and to fix big problems. How could you spend $1 trillion and basically not fix a single structural issue in the Australian economy? It's kind of a bit heartbreaking, isn't it? So tell us about Albo's speech. That obviously sort of contained some big economic thinking and then some specific policy proposals. Can you just tell us a little bit about what's being advocated for by Labor?
Yeah, well, I think Albo did a terrific job of kind of filling the void, the void in leadership and vision and ambition that was missing, only 2 nights earlier. So by the time that Albo stood up on the Thursday night, we'd had a couple of days to try and work out what was in the budget, but I think in this case, more importantly, what wasn't in the budget. And so I think he did a great job of filling that void and giving people a sense of, how do we make things better after than before?
Yeah.
What I tried to say at the press club, I probably did it inelegantly, and he did a better job on the Thursday night, but to kind of say it would be amazing if we went through all of this together and then woke up in a few years' time and thought we haven't learned anything from it, we haven't tried to make things better than they were before. And so I think that's the sort of frame that I look at his good speech through. And the big initiatives, as you know, I think there are really 4 big planks to it, which go to the future economy, and which is obviously a key concern of your portfolio and the future of work. But if you think about it, there was a big commitment on childcare. There was a big commitment on transmission, and particularly kind of cleaner and cheaper energy. There was a big commitment on social housing. And there was a big commitment on trying to ensure all this money that government spends on procurement, on buying stuff, infrastructure, rail particularly, defence programs. How do we get more advantages for our workers out of that, particularly apprenticeships and traineeships? And when you look through that, the thing that unites those 4 big policy initiatives is when you recognise that there's no choice between borrowing money or not, but there is a choice between getting value for that money that you borrow or not, then you're looking for things that tick a lot of boxes. And so childcare obviously is about women's participation in work. It's good for kids. It's good for the workforce. It's good for the economy. It ticks a lot of boxes. Social housing, labour intensive, if you can do it quickly, builds a lasting benefit for our most vulnerable people. Cleaner and cheaper energy, self-explanatory. Getting more apprenticeships, absolutely crucial when you think of the way that the training system's been hollowed out the last 7 years. So we were looking for those kind of win-wins. And I think one of the reasons why it's been received so well is because all of these things were more or less missing from what the government proposed a couple of days before that. Yeah.
So it's really some really big, exciting ideas in there. And let's just talk about a couple in a bit more detail. Jim, childcare is something that you and I have talked about a lot over the years. And I'm always fascinated by these issues in public policy where there's just this massive gap between what we should be doing and we know we should be doing and what we're actually doing. And there's kind of 3 or 4 areas in Australian public policy where you just see this great chasm. And I'm just interested, the childcare stuff has been amazing. My constituents are talking to me about it all the time. It's really cut through. why has childcare not been solved before? It's just that there are so many beneficiaries of this, and it's just amazing that it kind of just gets left off the table as an economic reform proposal time and time again. So just tell us a bit about the politics in there.
Well, that expression on your face just then, Claire, we've all seen that thousands of times in our communities, particularly in terms of our contemporaries. That sort of, it's hard to believe why the government wouldn't recognise all those advantages that I ran through a moment ago. As you know, but maybe people on the call don't know, the biggest faction in the Labor Party federally is the Young Parents faction, and so it might be a function of us knocking around with a lot of contemporaries who've got little kids. But the benefits of early childhood education for kids. It's a labour-intensive industry in the care economy. It's got massive upsides in terms of participation, but also productivity, massive social benefit in terms of intergenerational disadvantage and all the things that you and I have talked about thousands of times over the last 10 or 15 years. And so I would love to be able to explain to friends on the call why the government doesn't go there, but I genuinely cannot explain or understand why that's the case.
Yeah, just for people who are interested and not as familiar with this topic, the Grattan Institute's done some amazing work on the benefits of investing in early learning. And they did this report that's a little bit old, it's about 5 years old now, that essentially ranked the impact of the biggest economic reform proposals for Australia: tax reform, IR reform, all the ones that we spend, probably 80% of our time in politics talking about. And the thing that had the biggest bang for buck was early learning. So I'm just, it's really great that Labor's really picked up the ball and run with that one. Jim, I think that the childcare stuff's been absolutely pervasive in the coverage. I want to talk about the procurement issue as well, because I think that's an important kind of ideological shift, isn't it, about thinking about how government can influence the economy. Could you talk a bit about what Labor's proposing there?
Yeah, so what we're talking about there is basically to recognise that there is a massive pipeline of investment in areas like, submarine building, but also in terms of, there are some big rail commitments around Australia, Cross River Rail here, the Metro where you are, the Metro in Sydney, the Metro in Perth, and other big projects, and a whole range of government spending where the government jumps up typically and makes a big announcement and says there's going to be a lot of jobs here. But then in terms of the follow through, in terms of Australian jobs, but particularly Australian apprentices and trainees, it kind of falls over at that point. And so what we would like to do is to make bidders on these projects guarantee that every 10th worker at least would be an Australian apprentice or trainee. And that's important for all of the obvious reasons, but also if you recognise that there is an appetite for us to have a diverse economy. Services is a big part of it, but some manufacturing and some other important components. And you've written it in some detail about the kind of idea of having a more complex economy, a more diverse economy. If we really care about that, then we need to get maximum advantage out of some of these projects that we're working on. It makes no sense whatsoever to kind of let that opportunity slip through our fingers when you consider that opportunities aren't exactly thick on the ground at the moment. We are in a desperate recession, and we do have a full-blown jobs crisis, and we risk losing a generation of workers, particularly young workers, but also older workers. And so to not do this, I think, would be negligent.
Yeah, I think it's really, really exciting, really good policy. Jim, just before we move on to some of the bigger picture issues, you spoke earlier this week about Josh Frydenberg's comment that 6% unemployment's kind of the goal for him, and then that's the point at which he's going to sort of step back and take off some of the supports that are available at the moment. You mentioned before one of my portfolios is the future of work, and everything I focus on in the future of work points in the one direction, and that is that the unemployment rate's actually not a great measure of how well people are doing in the world of work. We've got, workplaces where, a third of Australians are not kind of permanently employed, don't have access to usual benefits, 1 million Australians in the gig economy. So I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about what measures you think we should be using to judge the economic recovery, and when do you think is the right point for us to start to talk about this as a crisis that's sort of finishing and over?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you've written in really compelling ways about this, the unemployment rate is one measure of the labour market, but it's nowhere near a comprehensive or effective measure of what's really going on. It often obscures a lot of insecure work, a lot of underemployment, a lot of underutilisation, as you've said many times in the past. And so we need to have a broader understanding of it. The Reserve Bank Governor talks about hours worked in the economy as being a really more effective measure, but there is a range of them, and you need to take them all together. You get a better picture of the labour market if you rely on 3 or 4 or 5 measures rather than just the unemployment rate. And at times, Josh Frydenberg has said that. He said the real unemployment rate's much higher than what's published. So it's hard to understand why he's going down that path, except that, he wanted to, before the budget, he wanted to shape up a bit of a kind of an excuse for what were going to be record levels of debt and deficit in the budget, having spent the last 7 years describing those outcomes as a debt and deficit disaster. He needed to shift the conversation. But when he did that, I think he made a big mistake. And it's revealing, because it shows that their main objective here is to treat what's happened as an aberration, supporting the economy and supporting work. They want that to be an aberration. They want to get as quickly as they can back to the pre-COVID economy, not recognising that a lot of people weren't faring very well in the pre-COVID economy either. But that's their objective. And so he came up with this 6% thing. But what that means is basically they're saying they want to put the queue in the rack when it comes to support for jobs. When we get to a situation where unemployment's around the level that it peaked at during the global financial crisis when we were working together on economic policy then. So it's quite hard to understand. Our view is you need to be more ambitious. We talked about ambition before. That's really one of the defining elements of that lack of ambition, to say that when we get to unemployment at 6 or just south of that, that all of a sudden, we can flick a switch back to austerity and to all of those issues that we had in the labour market before any of us had ever heard of coronavirus.
Absolutely. So, Jim, just on that point, and just sort of switching focus now to talk a little bit more about structural issues. Thinking about the economy before COVID, what are your big concerns about the sort of shape and way that Australia's economy is growing?
Really, just that trend towards kind of insecure work, I think, is the main. I think the defining feature of the economy before COVID was insecurity. Financial and workplace insecurity, that trend towards, casualisation, underemployment, all of those sorts of things. I think that was the defining feature before, because it fed, the stagnant wages that we'd seen for a long time. It fed the consumption problem that we had, a lack of spending power in our communities. All of that was in one way kind of related. That's one big basket of issues. And the second one was we had a really big problem with investment, as you know, because businesses there wasn't a big enough appetite to invest. And one of the reasons for that, and one of the reasons why it's a passion of mine, and I know yours, is we had this massive energy policy uncertainty where the coalition had 22 energy policies in 7 years. And we do a lot of boardroom conversations with the business community. And in almost every one, people say to us, why can't we just get a foundation of energy policy certainty? You can dial up or dial down your ambition on emissions, but get some basic rules of the road, because there's a lot of capital looking for somewhere to invest, but a handbrake on that has been energy policy uncertainty. So I think those are the two things: insecure work feeding stagnant wages and a lack of consumption, and then a lack of investment, which is partly, not solely, but partly a product of energy policy uncertainty.
Yeah. They're really big problems, but with that $1 trillion of debt that the government's racked up, it is so frustrating, isn't it? You could have blown a really big hole in a couple of those issues if you had a different government in Canberra when this had all hit us. Jim, I'm interested to understand a bit of your thinking about the role of the private sector in driving growth in Australia. Some commentators have kind of looked at the government's budget and our response and said, one's a private sector option, one's a public sector option. Is that how you see things? Or can you just talk a little bit about what your views are about private sector-led growth?
I think it's a really misleading oversimplification, and it's partly fed by the government. The government is desperate to have an ideological fight. They like to kind of carve up the argument into two polarised pieces and hope that their piece of it is bigger. And so that's what they're doing now. You can see them coming from a mile away, typically on these sorts of arguments. They don't do subtly. The Prime Minister in particular is not a subtle fella. So they want to have this argument, and they want to pretend that using the resources of government to make wise investments in places like childcare is some kind of, form of, communism, which is obviously absurd. Our argument is about balance, and it's about bang for buck, as you said before. And I feel like there's an imbalance in what the government's proposing. They're putting all of their eggs, or almost all of their eggs, in one basket to incentivise business investment. We think that's an important task. Some of the things that they put in their budget, we've been calling for in the tax system, for example. We think that's really important. We're not against that. We need the private sector to be purring again, creating wealth and creating jobs and opportunities for people. So that's not contested from our point of view. What is contested is the balance in the budget. And it makes no sense when you consider, you mentioned the Grattan report on childcare, and the kind of, the egghead term is kind of fiscal multipliers. How do you get most value for money? And some of the things that Anthony's talking about, childcare, but also energy investment, training, and social housing, that's right up the top of the charts when it comes to value for money. So from our point of view, strike a good balance between incentivising the private sector, but making good, smart, intelligent public investments as well. And that gives ourselves, I think, the best chance to succeed, because we're getting bang for the buck on both sides of the budget, and we're not putting all of our eggs in one basket.
Absolutely. I love it. Jim, you mentioned wages growth as one of the kind of structural issues in the economy pre-COVID. And I want to talk a little bit more about that, because those of us who are sort of in the centre left, this is a diabolical problem for our whole model of sharing the benefits of economic growth with as many people as possible. I think the budget says that we're going to see, they predict wages growth of 1.25% next year and economic growth of 4.25%. Probably, firstly, question is that really realistic? But I just want to get your thoughts on what you think we need to be doing about this. It is such a structural issue that threatens really the whole kind of egalitarian nature of our society. What do we need to do?
It really does. And I think that kind of decoupling between not just growth and wages, but also profits and wages, has been a really, extraordinarily troubling trend for some time now. Again, not just something that popped up with the virus, but something that had been hanging around for a while. And you're right, it's probably for parties of Labor and parties of the centre left around the world, it's very difficult, because a lot of this insecurity and stagnant wages is flowing from technological change, or changes in the gig economy, or whatever it might be. And so as parties of the centre left who believe in kind of progress and modernisation of the economy, then we've got to make some difficult choices here, because this is the direction of travel, but it's really hurting the people that we represent. And our task often is not to, as I said the other day, kind of try and slow down the pace of change, but to find a place for people in change and make sure that people aren't being dudded by the changes in our economy and in our society more broadly. So it's a massive challenge. And wages are obviously a function of all of that insecurity and all that casualisation and underemployment that we talked about a moment ago. So in terms of what we do about it, clearly there's an industrial relations component to it. I don't think the IR side of the gig economy in particular is, as our other colleagues have been saying for some time, I don't think that's quite right yet. Clearly there's a training component. We need to make sure there's not a mismatch between the opportunities we're training people for and the opportunities that are actually available to them. I think of it as training for technology. Need to make sure that system's really nimble and fast-paced and keeping up. And it also goes to the kind of model of overall growth that we have. Do we recognise that growth? You mentioned the 4 and a bit growth that they're expecting in the economy next year. That's an aggregate number which will disguise for a lot of communities, the really patchy nature of this recovery.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so we need kind of place-based understandings of what's going on, and place-based jobs programs and all of those sorts of things, because the kind of growth that you and I believe in, and friends on the call, I'm assuming, believe in, is a more inclusive type of growth, where it's not just an aggregate understanding where some people are doing really well, a lot of people are doing really badly. We need to try and work out how we can bring more people with us, place-based IR training, but also just an overall a more inclusive vision of growth.
Yeah, it's a really important issue. And, you made that point about education, Jim. One of the things that Hawke and Keating they get a lot of accolades for economic reform, but probably not as much for the massive advances of the education levels of the Australian population. Like, they knew they were creating an economy where more skills meant you were better off, and they helped Australians get more skilled. But, really since the Rudd-Gillard government's left office, we haven't seen much advances in Year 12 retention rates, in people getting through the skills and training system. The other one that's always on my mind is, because I have technology as a portfolio, our digital skills mismatch in Australia is just a crying shame. There was a Deloitte report that was released last year that said Australia would need 121,000 IT graduates over the next 5 years for good, well-paid, permanent jobs of the future. And we were going to educate 38,000 people through our system in Australia. So it's just literally like 80,000 jobs of the future just walking out the door, because we haven't got that good conversation between the needs of the economy and the needs of the skills sector. So there's a lot of room to move there. Jim, I want to ask about growth. We know that the context here is that centre-left parties have been having a difficult time globally. We haven't won some elections that we thought we would win, I think, around the world in recent years. And some people have said that that's because centre-left parties are talking too much about redistribution and focusing their policy energy there, and not enough on growing the pie and that question of growth. What do you think about that?
Look, I think it's a fair criticism in the kind of global context. I don't think it says that parties like us don't care about growth, but I think that we've fallen out of the habit of talking about growth, or talking about what I call, growth and redistribution, not growth or redistribution.
Mm-hmm.
And it's another one of those kind of binaries that our opponents love, because they like the kind of black and white sense that we're anti-growth and they're pro-growth. And that's happened around the world, and not to dance on the kind of political graves of anyone, but you watch the UK contest of the last parliamentary term in Britain, and you can see how that critique can become relevant in some cases. In Australia, we need to guard against that as well, to be frank about it, but we've got a really proud record. Our most successful governments have been, pro-growth, whether it's protecting growth in the GFC or before that, creating 3 decades of continuous economic growth. So we've got a proud story to tell. We've got a good record on growth, and we need to make sure that we can explain to people that, we're not against, we want the economy to gallop, because that gives us the best opportunity to spread the opportunities of a growing economy more fairly. It means we can better fund services. It means people can get ahead and not just get by. And that means we need to recognise that we should celebrate people getting ahead too. There's an important part of that which fits into that piece. But I wrote some stuff for Tanya Plibersek's book, which has just come out, really about a Labor version of growth and the story that we need to be telling there. And it really comes back to some of these issues of not allowing us to be painted as anti-growth when we've got such a good record on growth, but also we've got good ideas about how you grow the economy in a more inclusive and more sustainable way, including by doing some of the things we've talked about, cleaner and cheaper energy, training for technology, commercialisation in your portfolio to turn good ideas into good jobs, place-based initiatives, some of the co-investment that we've talked about before in the context of our hero, Mazzucato, all of these sorts of things, they are a far more compelling strategy for growth than what our opponents dish up,
yeah.
Which typically harsh industrial relations, the rhetoric of red tape reduction and the like, which hasn't delivered broad-based growth in the past, and we've got no reason to believe it would deliver broad-based growth in the future.
Fantastic. Yeah. For those who didn't catch that reference, Jim and I are both big fans of Italian economist named Mariana Mazzucato.
We're her biggest
fans. So if you haven't heard about her, just have a Google. She's got some amazing YouTube videos. Really, really fascinating person. Jim, love your comments there. And it's frustrating, isn't it? Because when you look at the track record of Labor governments federally, the Hawke and Keating governments, obviously that's their profound achievement, was on opening up the economy and delivering the longest running period of growth that we're aware of in history globally. And then the run-and-Gillard governments that you were so intimately involved in, where Australia was one of only 2 developed countries to avoid a massive global recession and saved hundreds of thousands of Australians from being on an unemployment queue. So I've got a very good story to tell here. Jim, just one last question before I hand over to the group. I'm sure you're watching with deep fascination the American election day by day as it unfolds. And I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit about what the implications are for us in Australia of the outcome of that election, and who do you think is going to win?
Well, with all of the usual caveats around, we don't have a vote, don't interfere in domestic politics and the like, obviously it's going to be a massively consequential election. As a believer in America, I'm, like many people, really worried about the turn that it's taken. When you think about race relations, you think about the economy, you think about the mismanagement of the virus and what that's meant for, hundreds of thousands of lives lost, some of them avoidably. Then we worry about the direction that the US has taken. I think it's more likely than not, but not certain, that Vice President Biden wins the election. But I think we were all a little bit scarred by our bold prediction in 2016. And so, we need to be careful about that. Anything's possible out of the American system, but I think more likely than not that it's President Biden emerges. And I think it does matter for the global economy. I think it matters for America's relations with the world. I think it would matter for the repairing of relationships with allies in particular. And in a policy sense, I think the most consequential thing will probably be in the climate change area.
Yeah.
Maybe a kind of a resuscitation of efforts to get global emissions down. And for those of us who believe in doing that in Australia, getting that cleaner and cheaper energy, I think if that were the case, then that would be helpful in terms of winning our own domestic arguments.
Yeah. There's an opportunity here to reset the kind of global bar for what climate action looks like. And $1.5 trillion on clean energy projects is going to do it. Okay, well, I think, Brett, I'll finish up with Jim there and hand him over to the very many people on the line here who've got questions of their own. So would you like to take over, Brett, and moderate that Q&A session?
Fantastic. Thanks, Claire, and thanks for that grilling, and thanks, Jim. Yeah, there's lots of people with questions in the chat and opinions and ideas, so we'll draw some of them out and some of the lessons there. First, I might throw to Cresta, who had a question early on in there about the NBN in particular.
Hi, hello. So for me, the quintessential bottom line of Mr. Albanese's budget reply last Thursday was the power of government. And so looking at the lessons learned from the GFC, and the disaster that Senator Conroy at the time caused, given the implementation of it being so widely privatised. So given service delivery models and everything at the moment, is there space for leasing some of these facilities, whether it's childcare, whether it's aged care, and using government bonds, but bolstering the service delivery model through local government?
Yeah, thanks, Cresta. I'm not sure I sign up to your view about the NBN being a disaster. I think we were sort of involved, and I think the big challenge there was to try and stack up that big kind of construction workforce quickly enough. I'm not sure that there was going to be a sort of a perfectly public version of that was going to work, but perhaps there are different views on that. In terms of more broadly about the kind of public-private distinction and how we best deliver services, I think there are areas where private provision has gone too far. Clearly, human services has been a big problem. You think about the provision of human services via the private sector has not worked as the government had hoped, and so clearly it's gone too far then. There are also some issues in the private part of aged care, as you identify in your question. And I think the Royal Commission will be looking at the kind of best optimal mix of public and private there. Clearly, of all the money that's going into aged care, we're not getting the care that people need and deserve, and there's not enough transparency on where that money's going. And so that will be inevitably a part of that discussion as well. I'm a believer in the public provision of goods, but I think in some cases there is the case for a mixed model, and including in some of the areas that you nominated. But I think the most important thing is we get government investment into those places, and we have a good transparent model so we know where the money's going and we know that we're getting value for that money.
Yeah, I mean, that's the point that Krista raised there, Jim, about, and I wouldn't agree that that Senator Conroy created the disaster, but there is one of the things this pandemic has shown up is that, not just in Australia, but all around the world, that private sector delivery of public services often is not up to the task in a crisis like this. And we see this in aged care and we see it in childcare, in particular in Australia. I mean, what do you think that Labor can do based on what you've just said to really transparency, to really fix those problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the key things we need to recognise is that small government proved to be unsuited for a big crisis. And in lots of ways, we're paying the price for the hollowing out of the state over a period of time, not just here, but around the world. I think that's almost, well, I think that's broadly agreed. In terms of what we do differently, you know, you take aged care, for example, we've got this Royal Commission, which will make some recommendations around funding and the public-private mix and all the rest of it. But already it's clear when you think about all the money that goes into aged care, we know very little about it. It's quite hard to believe when you think about government investment, the stories that you hear out of some of these facilities, and largely private facilities, of, you know, people being malnourished, people being neglected and the like. So obviously there's a problem there. And so if we are to, as Labor people, we want to see more investment in the care economy in particular. If that extra investment is to actually make a difference to people's lives, then it needs to be more transparent, and the mix between public and private needs to be bang on.
Yeah, we've been doing a bit of work here at Chifley on childcare as well, and data of where the profits go from private childcare providers and all of that instead of back into the system is very difficult because of the transparency there as well. So I might ask, there's a couple of specific questions that were in there about specific areas. I know that Meeta Chowdhury had a question about the creative sector. Meeta, are you there and would like to ask it? No. That's okay, no problem. There's a couple of questions in there, Jim, as well, and Claire, about job seeker and increase the job seeker. You know, where are you guys at? Your thoughts on that at the present time?
Yeah, so well, two parts to that, I think, Brett, and job seeker is crucial because we've got an issue in the economy with spending power, but we've also got an enduring issue that it's too hard for people to support themselves and look for work on $40 a day. So the first part of our campaign is to make sure that the job seeker supplement, which was put into the economy for good reason and is doing a lot of good, isn't prematurely withdrawn. It was cut on the last weekend of September. We think that's too early when you consider the weakness in the economy, particularly in Victoria, but not just Victoria, and in big pockets of Australia. And so our first priority was to try and argue that it not be cut. We've been unsuccessful so far. The next priority is obviously to ensure that wherever the new permanent rate of job seeker settles, it's more than the old New Start rate, that $40 a day rate. And a lot of our friends in our movement, they would like us to nominate now, you know, a number that we believe it should be. And I understand people's you know, desire to do that. But what we have to recognise is the government will come out between now and Christmas and nominate a rate. There's still a budget update and another full budget to go before the election. So we kind of need to understand what the situation is that we'll inherit in terms of the New Start or the job seeker rate, in terms of what the economy looks like and what the budget looks like. But we will take a position to the economy on the permanent to the election on the permanent rate of job seeker, but we think it's premature to do that right now.
Right, thanks, Jim. And I think we've fixed our technical glitch and unmuted Meeta. So Meeta.
Hi, thank you for letting me, and thanks to Shadow Treasurer. My question is, like, I'm not an economist, so I don't understand the economy that much. But my only question is, I realized, and I was noticing that during this pandemic, like government offer lots of support for lots of industries, but there wasn't a big support for creative industries like artists. I'm a visual artist, and most of the time we work like independently, and we don't work under someone. And it's very often hard to access those funds and everything and the grant. So, and it was frustrating to say that government not have any initiative for creative industries, artists. They're like all these people who work in this industry. And at the same time, when our opposition leader forecast his plan, there wasn't also anything for artists like us. So it's like, why is that? Why we not being inclusive?
Yeah, thanks very much, Meeta. I think you're right to identify that one of the big groups of workers or of people that have been left behind in this recession have been people in the creative industries, in arts and entertainment. And I think one of the big kind of realizations that we've come to as a country is that that sector isn't just kind of, Kate Blanchett, accepting an Academy Award, as important, lovely as that is. There is a massive workforce associated with this part of the economy. And it's crucial because of, culture and arts and entertainment's crucial for all the reasons that you would be familiar with. It lifts our horizons and invests in the way that we think about ourselves, but it's also got a massive economic role to play in the way that we generate jobs and generate opportunities. And so what we've said, and the reason why it wasn't a massive part of Anthony's budget reply, is we think that there are two things that can happen immediately which aren't happening. First of all, too many workers in your industry have been excluded from JobKeeper. And the reason that many of your colleagues have been excluded from JobKeeper, partly because of the reason you identified you work for yourself, but also a lot of people, they might have been working in the industry as a casual for 10 years, but because you might work for a different production or a different event or something like that, then it looks like you don't have a same employer for 12 months. And so you've been excluded from JobKeeper. So the big priority is to get you hooked up to JobKeeper. And the second thing is the government stood up with, I think, Guy Sebastian a few months ago in Western Sydney, and they announced this big package for you all. And for months afterwards, not a cent had flowed from the assistance package that they announced. And I'm yet to meet anyone who's had any benefit whatsoever from that fund. And so our first two priorities, to get that money flowing and to get people access to JobKeeper. And then in time, we'll have a view about the industry going forward that Tony Burke is no doubt working on.
Thanks, Jim. So on sectors of the economy that have been ignored by this government, we know that there's been a big problem with higher ed. So Peter Redden has a question about higher ed.
Yeah, thanks very much. And Jim, I'm not stalking you. It's nice to see you again. Specifically around tertiary education and higher ed, the federal government has continually cut the funding. And at the same time, we're seeing students' fees increasing. Just wondering what the position is in the future with Labor and what position will be taken around the tertiary sector. And I won't even start to discuss the fact that I believe, this is a political and ideologue targeting of particular parts of tertiary sector. But yes, specifically around funding and fees. Thanks, Jim. Yeah,
I think where you finished that point, Peter, is really important. We watch these characters from our side of the House of Representatives, Clare and I, and it just looks like a kind of the carry-on of some kind of student politics vendetta, some kind of ideological view that they bring to it. Even the ministers for education don't really seem to believe in higher education and universities. It's quite bizarre, and it's especially bizarre when you think about it like this. You've got all of these people, and particularly young people, who've been displaced in some way by this recession. And you'd think that almost the primary task of government would be to work out, okay, how do we prepare all of these people to grab the opportunities of the recovery when it comes? And to do that, it needs to be the opposite of making it harder, less accessible and more expensive to go to university. And so it's a bit like childcare. It's a head scratcher there is no explanation for it that I can understand apart from an ideological one. And one of the kind of key differences that I'd hope we could make as an incoming Labor government is to restore the university sector's rightful place, not just in terms of education, as important as that is, but research and development as well, and all of those, crucial contributions that unis make to the economy that you'd be familiar with.
Right. So through me, Neil Mansfield on the chat, who's on the NDIS and hoping to get his scooter soon. He says we hope he does too. He's got a question about the federal government not going to spend money on supported housing for the disabled and government housing. And so what's Labor going to do about that?
Yeah, well, thanks, Neil. And I hope you've got a good federal member to help you navigate that, the NDIS. And if you don't, then let us know and we can talk to them for you. I hope that scooter's on its way. In terms of public housing and social housing, it's one of those things where, I probably get in the habit of talking about it too much in economic terms, but the idea that, when you think about our responsibilities to people as a government and as a nation, putting a roof over people's heads is obviously right near the top of the list. And so what we've said is more needs to be done, but as a start, why don't we recognise there's 100,000 public housing units in Australia that are in disrepair, and why don't we fix those up for people, because that'll have an immediate economic benefit, but it'll also mean people can live in a decent place with dignity. So that's our first step in what we're proposing, but I suspect we'll be making more announcements and commitments in this area, because it's one of those things where you get lots of bang for buck in the economy, but more importantly, lots of bang for buck in our society, so that people aren't sleeping rough and people aren't living in conditions which are unfitting for a first world, first-rate country like ours.
So Nigel D'Souza has a question on paying for Labor's promises, which obviously has been in the past in various elections, as Clare alluded to and discussed. Nigel, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I agree and support all the great ideas being talked about here in the Labour and left of centre governments and party. But I find this great reluctance to talk of how we will raise money. The same thing with the Liberal Party, and it appears that Labour Party is similar. We keep promising and promising and promising we can do this and that. Almost every problem is a money issue. We'll give you money for this and we'll do that. How do you raise the money? Every idea is good, but where do you raise the money from?
Yeah.
One of our attendees talked about modern monetary theory. I've read about that. That is, a lot of economists don't agree with that. It simply says you can keep governments borrow indefinitely and don't have to pay back. I simply don't agree with that. But would like to hear, what do Labour got to raise the taxes for this sort of thing?
Yeah, thanks, Nigel. I think it is true that a lot of the initiatives that are important right now in this recession and thinking about the recovery do require committing money, but there are some that don't. You think about what we need to do in order to create some certainty in the energy policy market. That's doesn't require a big outlay from the budget, and there are other opportunities there too. But I think your broader point is fair enough. We are, both sides are committing, quite large sums to this issue, to this, once in a century event. I think that's appropriate, and I think debt and deficit matters, but in times like these, it doesn't matter more than supporting jobs and supporting people in their communities. And so, for the time being, I think we're going to be running, either side in government would be running an expansionary fiscal policy, an expansionary budget strategy. But I'm a bit like you in the sense that I don't believe that can go on forever. I'm not a devotee or an enthusiast of modern monetary theory. I understand where people are coming from, but I think the debt does need to be repaid. And from my point of view, when that happens, it needs to be done gradually and responsibly. It needs to be done by growing the economy, but it also needs to be done by not asking the most vulnerable people to carry a disproportionate burden, which is what happened in the 2014 budget. So when the time comes, you think about the three ways that you can repair the budget: growth, spending changes or tax changes. Both sides will be contemplating some mix of that. But the highest priority has got to be growth in the near term, jobs in the near term, because the budget will be in much worse nick down the track if we don't get on top of this problem in the economy in the first place.
So Kevin Hayes has a point on a question about market failure being a recurring theme.
Yes, hi, Daniel and Jim and Claire. Thank you for the work you do and your commentary. I'm really concerned that people haven't picked up the government is not being responsible government, it's being an irresponsible government. Market failure happens quite on a regular basis. We're finding market failing in health, childcare, aged care, in terms of skill development. How do you see the government's role to intervene in order to correct market failure, to give it a sense of purpose and direction? Would you like to comment about government's role in addressing market failure?
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. I mean, I think there's different categories, right? So obviously market design is important, and I think there'll be an opportunity out of the Aged Care Royal Commission to contemplate, market design in aged care and the financial incentives and the like. So I think that's part of it. Regulation's part of the story, making sure that we have the right kind of guardrails in our economy, and particularly with our service provision. And also the kind of tied funding. How do we make sure that when we are funding these sectors, and some of those that you mentioned we fund substantially, significantly, how do we make sure that we are creating the conditions for that funding which get good outcomes and not allow the kind of lack of transparency that we've seen in aged care, for example. So I think at least those three levers, and there might be more as well, but we need to be smarter about deploying those three levers. That doesn't mean the kind of over-regulation that the government wants to talk about. It doesn't always mean heavy intervention. It just means being smart about how we set up these funding structures so that we're getting the right incentives and the right outcomes.
Thanks, Jim. And because here at Chifley Research Centre, we like to honour Labor history, but also our own history, I thought I'd bring up another former Executive Director of the Chifley Research Centre, Michael Cooney, to ask a question.
Thanks, Brett. Thank you for consigning me to the pages of Chifley Research Centre history.
I'll be there soon.
You'll enjoy it. Welcome to Valhalla. Dr. Chalmers, I was interested, you talked a bit about jobs and growth as the key to budget repair, and I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about the contrast between the budget plan outlined by the government and then the plan you're outlining about regional jobs specifically. It feels a bit like there's a very long-running debate between the Liberals and Conservatives proposing tax and IR changes and Labor proposing infrastructure and skills as the kind of alternative approaches to jobs generally. But thinking especially about the fact that we're in the middle of a Queensland election campaign, it felt strange that there wasn't anything really about central Queensland jobs, for instance, or other parts of regional Queensland in the budget. I know you live there, but also spent a lot of time up there immediately after the election. I was just interested in what you're thinking about jobs in central Queensland in particular.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And I think for as long as you and I have knocked around together, we've had this kind of obsession with outer suburban and regional renewal. I kind of feel like when we think about our economy, often the suburbs and the regions, the regional towns in particular, kind of fall between those two stools, between the inner city and the kind of rural, the bush. And so part of what I'm trying to do is to say, well, we won't recover as strongly as we need to unless the outer suburbs and the provincial towns, are a bigger part of our economic story. So I think that's where we kind of begin with this. When we were sitting down working out, and you'd know from your own service in government, in that budget week, and particularly the budget reply, you start with a menu of maybe a dozen things, and you're trying to work out what are our top 3 or 4 priorities out of that for the budget reply. And one of the things which I think got over the line our plan for modernising the energy grid is because if you think about central Queensland, you think about other key regions of Australia, where there is a need for opportunities, You know, a lot of this transmission infrastructure would be really labour intensive in the regions particularly. And so one of the things that got that initiative over the line was that. But I also, and coming back to what we said to Claire, when Claire and I were talking before, is, you know, we can't assume that we just have a kind of an approach to jobs that applies equally to central Queensland as it does to the western suburbs of Melbourne or something like that. You know, we need kind of quite specific place-based initiatives. You know, as you said, I've spent a lot of time in regional Queensland the last 9 weeks. I've been to eight towns in regional Queensland. And what you understand there is the economy is almost unrecognisable in one town versus the next. And so we need to be quite specific. That means working with local council, local employer groups, local industries to come up with, you know, policies for jobs rather than a policy for jobs.
Fantastic. All right. Well, we're nearly at 1:30 and we always promise people we'll make these sessions go for an hour. So there are plenty of other questions in, but we would go way too long. So I wanted to say thank you to Jim for being our guest today. And thank you for Claire for being our awesome host. And thank you for both of you for the work you're doing in pushing forward a really future-focused narrative for Australian Labor. And thank you to everyone who's signed in today. Really appreciate it. We'll have some more of these Chifley Conversations over the next few weeks, including, if we can pull some off, some quite interesting and surprising events. So stay tuned to your emails about what we got coming up over the next month to 6 weeks or so. But with that, I hope you all have a lovely weekend. And thank you again to Jim and Claire. And as always, stay safe, everybody.
Thanks, Brett and Claire and everybody. Much
Thanks,
appreciated.
guys. Great to chat. See you later.
So, yeah.